But before we get to that, why don't we move on to the next segment here, which is our national polling update. Still pretty much what we saw the other day. Really good for Biden. um, yeah, why don't you talk us through this particle? It pretty much looks like what it looks like, doesn't it?
Yeah, so no real major updates. Interesting to note that there's an uptick to both candidates, but that's just really reflecting as other candidates are dropping out of the race, and so there was a lot more vote to go around over the last 10 days or so. But yeah, just the continuing upward trajectory of Biden. I mean, he's north of 50% in some of these polls. It doesn't seem nationally that Sanders is getting there, and so national polls might be somewhat of a silly metric to be using at this point, considering the large number of Democratic voters who have already cast their votes. And so it's sort of it's a tough metric to really say anything about the race because we're asking people who would you vote for, and they may have already voted. Um, However, having said that, just nationally, a trend definitely favoring Biden. But one of the metrics I think is maybe a little bit more useful is continuing to look at the state polls. And we're not going to do a rundown of each of the polls, but we could switch over to Florida here, which is coming up soon. And this is another case where we see a slight uptick of both candidates as they continue to drop out. But Biden looking like the clear favorite in Florida as we go into Super Tuesday number 3, whatever we've decided to call it. But this could be another big delegate haul next week for Joe Biden if this race is still going on at that point. I mean, the polling numbers are just reflecting pretty accurately what we're sort of talking about. We don't have it. We don't have it prepped as something we're going to talk about, but to kind of talk to Alex, how is this shift in the polling reflecting some of the broader shifts that we're seeing in the DDHQ public forecast that we've seen?
Yeah, I mean, if you go back to the national polling slide real quick, um, it's it, it's pretty indicative if you look at the last month, where Bernie all of a sudden surged ahead of Biden. The model essentially had two big swings, and they essentially are a quicker version. In other words, the polling is a little bit of a lagged indicator compared to this. The first big swing was in the week leading up to Nevada, and the subsequent model that we ran after the Nevada results, and that roughly tracks with Bernie's peak there in the polling. The second big swing, which ended up being much bigger, was in the couple days before South Carolina, the 3 days between South Carolina and Super Tuesday, and then the first model that we ran after Super Tuesday. Biden surged, I think it was about 40 points um, during that time period, and you can see here that the swing is roughly 40 points as well in the polling. So the model has sort of in a way beaten the polling by about a day or two, just because polling is a bit of a lagged indicator, um, but it's been tracking it pretty well.
Yeah, this is, I mean, just the polling swing is so interesting, especially as we look at just this historical trend that we have here. I mean, going back to September, we had Biden ahead pretty much through and through until Sanders started getting some of the momentum. This shift in the polls and this swing, I mean, on the one hand, we keep talking about the Biden surge from South Carolina and into Super Tuesday and just how this race has been totally turned upside down. But another way of looking at it is the long-term leader in the polls is doing very well. And yes, I understand I'm like overstating the case, but Biden was the front runner for pretty much the entire and for the entire race. There was a brief period when he was dipping in the polls. But I mean, we could be looking at this Biden surge, but we could also just be looking at this as a Bernie bubble.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting to look at Biden this cycle compared to Jeb Bush in 2016 or Rudy Giuliani in 2008. They, to an extent, in the early polling, in the polling, 1 year away from Iowa, look very similar. They start to take divergent paths in the summer of the year prior, with Jeb, starting to fade. Rudy still looking decent, and Biden still looking decent, but then there's this dip that all three of them take when the primaries start, and Biden was able to recover from it, and the other two were not. So it really is something that I think is going to be studied for a while, and I think it's an open question as to how much of this was Bernie messing things up, how much of this was a few of the other candidates selfishly or unselfishly. See, on the outside, it appears unselfish, dropping out at the perfect time for Biden, and how much of it had to do with Biden himself.
Yeah, I mean, we are looking sort of at an artifact here with this two-person race, and for much of that, there was obviously a much larger field. And again, I keep coming back to something I think you guys have talked about, the inverse relationship between Bloomberg and Biden. As people were sort of trying to decide who was going to be the avatar of the, for want of a better term, moderate lane, to take on Trump. And obviously, Biden won that battle. I think we look at it now as a Sanders-Biden race, but there really were other fights that led up to that, almost like, the NCAA tournament or something. You have to get through a couple of rounds till you get to this. So, that's why I think the question of, did Sanders blow it or Biden win it or some combination of the two? But there were those preliminary rounds, too, that actually, set the stage for this. And like any other primary, right? It's a survive. It's almost not so much a winner; it's just a survivor of it. Biden has weathered the storms that all those candidates faced.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with that. I think looking at just
you're a very smart man, Particle. So.
Well, just trying to figure out
anything but that.
It's trying to figure out whether or not there were actually lanes at one point. Between, say, the so-called progressive lane and then the so-called moderate lane or establishment lane, and trying to figure out whether or not these were going to consolidate or whether or not this is even a useful way of thinking about the primary. And I think despite the debates about whether or not thinking about it in lanes was helpful, I think at the end of the day, we could say that, maybe we don't call it a progressive lane and a moderate lane, just because we're not necessarily seeing Elizabeth Warren supporters say jump over to join the Bernie boat. But there's definitely a Bernie lane and then an anti-Bernie lane over the last few weeks.
And also, I think you look at it as ideological lanes is one way, and it's layers, right? It's not sort of in a binary choice of things. But the one thing that's kind of been constant throughout this is Democratic primary voters saying the one thing they care about is beating Trump. And so instead of maybe competing for leadership of lanes, it's more like the Bachelor or the Bachelorette. It's like who gets the rose at the end to be, their champion. And that's kind of, if a progressive had been seen as the most likely one to beat Trump, they might have won, if that's the criteria. But yeah, it's hard to break down what tens of millions of people are thinking, because they're not, one organism thinking it. There's a lot of things that go into it.